Margaret's neighbors traded her to a crippled savage without hesitation, deeming her worthless at 52. In Swifthawk's lodge, her trembling hands would craft not just a new life, but a love that transformed both their broken worlds. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The amber light of dusk filtered through the windows of Margaret Wilson's small room, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards where scraps of fabric lay scattered like fallen leaves. Her fingers, weathered but still nimble, guided the needle through layers of cotton with practiced precision. At 52, the lines etched around her eyes spoke of a life lived fully, if not easily. Outside, the sounds of Fort Benton, Montana Territory, 1872, drifted through the thin walls. Horses' hooves on packed dirt, men's laughter from the saloon down the street, the distant call of a mother summoning children home before darkness fell completely. Margaret paused, rubbing the ache from her knuckles as she held up the dress she'd been mending for Mrs. Holloway, the banker's wife. Her small room above the general store had been home for nearly 3 years now, ever since she'd arrived on the stagecoach from St. Louis with nothing but her sewing kit and a determination to make her own way after her husband's death had left her with debts, but no children to lean on. "Miss Wilson?" A tentative knock accompanied the voice. "Are you still working?" "Come in, Sarah," Margaret called, recognizing the shop owner's daughter. The door creaked open and the girl's anxious face appeared. At 16, Sarah Thornton carried the fresh beauty of youth that Margaret sometimes caught herself envying in unguarded moments. "Pa says there's talk of Apache raids just 20 miles south," Sarah said, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. 3 homesteads burned since last week. Margaret set aside her sewing, trying to ignore the flutter of fear in her chest. "Your father's concerned we might be next?" Sarah nodded, her blonde curls bouncing. "The men are meeting at the church hall tonight. Everyone's to attend." Her eyes darted around the modest room. "Pa says you should come too." Something in the girl's hesitation made Margaret pause. "Of course, I'll be there. Tell your father thank you for the warning." When Sarah left, Margaret moved to the small mirror hanging beside her bed. The face that looked back at her wasn't ugly. She'd never been a great beauty even in her youth, but her features were pleasant, her grey eyes still bright with intelligence. Yet she knew how the town saw her, a widow, childless, too old for remarriage, but still young enough to be useful with her needle and thread. Useful, she whispered to her reflection, but expendable. The church hall buzzed with tension. Men stood in clusters, voices low but urgent. Women gathered in corners, some crying softly, others stoically preparing bandages from torn sheets. Margaret slipped in quietly, taking a seat at the back, where widows and spinsters like herself always seemed to gather, the margins of society even in crisis. Sheriff Donovan stood at the front, his weathered face grave beneath his mustache. "Folks, I won't sugarcoat this. The raids are getting closer. Fort Russell has denied our request for more soldiers. We're on our own." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. "We've got 20 able men," Donovan continued. "Some rifles, limited ammunition. If the Apache decide to hit us in force..." He left the sentence unfinished. Thornton, the storekeeper, rose from his seat. "What about negotiating? There's that settlement of peaceful Apache north of the river. Could they intervene?" "Already tried," the sheriff responded. "Chief Grey Wolf sent word. They might help, but they want something in return." "What? We've barely got supplies for ourselves," someone shouted. Donovan raised his hands for quiet. "They want horses, ammunition, medicine, and a woman." The hall fell silent. Margaret felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "A woman?" Mrs. Holloway finally asked, her voice faint with horror. "Whatever for?" "One of their warriors, Swifthawk, I believe they called him. His wife died last winter. They say he needs someone to tend his lodge." "That's barbaric," Reverend Miller exclaimed. "We can't simply hand over one of our women to savages." The sheriff's gaze swept the room, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "I don't like it any more than you do, Reverend, but we're talking about the lives of everyone here." As the arguments escalated, Margaret watched the faces of the town council members. She noticed how their eyes occasionally flickered to the back of the room, where she sat with the other dispensable women. The calculation in their expressions was unmistakable. By midnight, when the meeting ended, Margaret knew with cold certainty what would happen. She returned to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and began to plan what few possessions she would take when they came for her. Dawn came with cruel swiftness. Margaret had slept fitfully, if at all, the weight of unspoken decisions pressing on her chest like stones. She rose before the sun, dressed in her best dress, a navy blue cotton with small white flowers that she had sewn herself, and began packing her meager belongings into a carpet bag that had seen better days. Her fingers trembled as she wrapped her mother's thimble in a handkerchief, tucking it between layers of clothing. The brass sewing scissors, her collection of needles, spools of thread in every color she could afford. These tools of her trade might be all that stood between her and complete helplessness in the days to come. A knock at the door made her spine stiffen. She had expected them, but not so soon. Not before she had time to fortify her resolve. "Come in," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Sheriff Donovan entered, hat in hand, flanked by Thornton and Mayor Gillespie. The men's discomfort was palpable in their shifting feet and averted eyes. "Miss Wilson," the mayor began, clearing his throat, "I trust you're aware of our situation." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "You've made your decision, then?" The men exchanged glances. Thornton at least had the decency to look ashamed. "The council met again after the gathering," Donovan said, his voice low. We've decided to accept Grey Wolf's terms, and I'm to be part of the payment." It wasn't a question. Mayor Gillespie puffed up, his jowls reddening. "Now, Miss Wilson, please understand. This is about the survival of this entire settlement. Children's lives are at stake." "Of course," she replied softly, and the council naturally considered all possible candidates before settling on me. The silence that followed confirmed what she already knew. There had been no deliberation, no drawing of lots. She, childless, husbandless, past 50, was the obvious sacrifice. "You'll be treated well, I'm sure," Thornton offered weakly. "These Apache aren't like the raiding parties. They trade with whites. They're civilized in their way." Margaret looked at him steadily until he dropped his gaze. "When am I to leave?" "This afternoon," the sheriff answered. "We've arranged a wagon. You'll be met at Crooked Creek by their representatives." "I see." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts. "Then I have preparations to complete, if you gentlemen would excuse me." They left awkwardly, mumbling assurances she didn't believe. When the door closed behind them, she allowed herself one moment of weakness, one silent tear that tracked down her cheek before she brushed it away with resolute fingers. By noon, word had spread throughout Fort Benton. Margaret felt the stares as she crossed the street to the general store, heard the whispers that fell silent as she approached. She purchased what supplies she could afford, a small sack of coffee, sugar, salt, matches, a sturdy knife. Luxuries, perhaps, where she was going, but small comforts she wasn't yet ready to surrender. Sarah Thornton found her there, eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Wilson, I'm so sorry. Pa says—" "Your father did what he thought necessary," Margaret interrupted gently. "There's no need for you to carry his burden. But it's not fair." The girl's distress was genuine, making Margaret wonder if perhaps she'd made more of a mark on this town than she'd realized. Life rarely is, child. She patted Sarah's hand. "Would you help me with something? I need to leave letters for my sister back east." By the time the wagon arrived, Margaret had said her goodbyes to the few who came, mostly women she'd sewn for, a couple of the shopkeepers who'd treated her fairly. No one from the council appeared, their courage apparently exhausted by the morning's confrontation. The wagon driver, a young man named Ellis, who worked at the livery, couldn't meet her eyes as he loaded her bag. "It's not right," he muttered, helping her onto the seat. "Sending you out there alone." "I've been alone for many years, Mr. Ellis," Margaret replied, settling her skirts around her. "This is merely a change of scenery." As the wagon pulled away from Fort Benton, Margaret didn't look back. She sat straight-backed on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded primly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the Montana plains met the vast, indifferent sky. Behind her, the town that had used her skills but never embraced her faded into the dust. Ahead lay uncertainty, fear, perhaps death. But there was something else too, a strange, unexpected spark that felt almost like freedom. The journey to Crooked Creek took nearly 4 hours, each mile increasing the distance between Margaret and everything familiar. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly, and dust coated her throat despite the kerchief she'd tied over her nose and mouth. Ellis remained largely silent, occasionally pointing out landmarks or offering her water from a canteen. His discomfort was evident in the rigid set of his shoulders and his too careful handling of the reins. "We're nearly there," he finally said as they crested a small rise. Below, a shallow creek wound through a valley dotted with cottonwoods. "That's Crooked Creek." Margaret nodded, unable to form words around the fear that had lodged itself in her throat. In the shadow of an enormous old cottonwood, she could make out 3 mounted figures waiting. Her hands, usually so steady with a needle, trembled in her lap. Ellis slowed the wagon. "Miss Wilson, it's not too late. We could turn back. I could take you to Helena instead. My cousin there would—" "And doom Fort Benton to attack?" She shook her head. "No, Mr. Ellis, what's done is done." He looked like he might argue, but then the mounted figures began moving toward them, and his face paled beneath its sunburn. He pulled the wagon to a stop, setting the brake with a shaking hand. The Apache riders approached slowly, deliberately. 2 men and a woman, their faces impassive, their dark eyes assessing. The leader, distinguished by the eagle feathers in his hair and the fine beadwork on his buckskin shirt, raised a hand in greeting. "I am White Elk," he said in surprisingly clear English. "You bring the woman?" Ellis swallowed hard. "This is Miss Wilson." White Elk's gaze shifted to Margaret. There was no cruelty in his expression, but no warmth either, just the cool assessment of a transaction being completed. "You come willingly?" he asked her directly. Margaret met his eyes. "I come as agreed." The Apache woman, wrapped in a blanket of deep red despite the heat, moved her horse closer. "I am many blankets," she said. Her English was more heavily accented. "I speak for Swift Hawk. You are older than we expected." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "I am 52. My hands are skilled with needle and thread. I can cook, clean, tend wounds." Many Blankets' expression remained unreadable as she translated for the third rider, who had hung back slightly. For the first time, Margaret studied him carefully. Swift Hawk, the man to whom she had essentially been sold. He was perhaps in his 40s, his face weathered by sun and wind, with deep lines around his eyes. His hair, streaked with grey, was longer than the others, falling past his shoulders. But what caught Margaret's attention was the way he sat on his horse. Slightly awkward, his left leg extended stiffly in a position that looked unnatural and surely uncomfortable. When he responded to many Blankets, his voice was deep and resonant, his words measured. The woman translated, "Swift Hawk says you have traveled far. He asks if you require rest before continuing to our village." The unexpected courtesy momentarily robbed Margaret of speech. She had prepared herself for contempt, for rough handling, perhaps even violence, but not for consideration of her comfort. "Thank him, but I'm able to continue," she finally replied. Ellis began unloading her belongings from the wagon, his movements jerky with nervous energy. White Elk dismounted to inspect the other goods brought as payment. Boxes of ammunition, medical supplies, sacks of coffee and sugar. He nodded in satisfaction. "Tell your people the agreement is honored," he said to Ellis. "Our warriors will patrol your boundaries. No hostile bands will cross while we watch." As Ellis prepared to leave, he approached Margaret awkwardly. "Miss Wilson, He trailed off, seemingly at a loss. "It's all right, Mr. Ellis," she said gently. "Please tell Sarah Thornton that I'll treasure the handkerchief she embroidered." He nodded, eyes suspiciously bright, then climbed back onto the wagon. Margaret watched as he turned the horses and headed back the way they'd come, the wagon growing smaller until it disappeared over the rise. Many blankets approached, leading a dun-colored mare. "You ride?" "Not for many years," Margaret admitted. The woman nodded, unsurprised. "You will learn again. For now, I help." With surprising strength, many blankets assisted Margaret onto the mare, showing her how to grip the mane and balance. Margaret's carpet bag and other supplies were secured behind Swifthawk on his horse. As they set off toward the Apache village, Margaret found herself riding beside Swifthawk. Up close, she could see that his left leg was indeed damaged, the knee fixed at an unnatural angle. He caught her looking, and their eyes met briefly. In that moment, Margaret saw something unexpected in his gaze. Not the disdain or lust she had feared, but a quiet dignity and perhaps a flicker of curiosity. They rode in silence, following the creek northward. The landscape opened before them, rolling hills giving way to more rugged terrain, dotted with pine and juniper. Birds called overhead, and once a deer bounded across their path, startling Margaret's horse. Swifthawk reached over quickly, steadying her mare with a practiced hand. "Ah, he said softly. "He says thank you for coming." Many blankets translated from behind them. "He says your courage honors our agreement." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The fear still coiled in her stomach, but beside it now flickered something else. The faintest spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she had not been consigned to a fate worse than death after all. The Apache village appeared as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the valley. It was larger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 30 dwellings arranged in a rough circle, with horses corralled nearby and smoke rising from cooking fires. As they approached, children paused in their play, women looked up from their tasks, and men stood watching with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Margaret felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure against her skin. She sat as straight as her aching back would allow, determined not to show weakness, despite the fear churning inside her. 4 hours on horseback had left her muscles screaming in protest, but she kept her face composed. White Elk led them into the center of the village, where an older man with silver hair and a deeply lined face waited. The man's posture radiated authority. Chief Grey Wolf, Margaret surmised. Behind him stood several other men, their arms crossed, their expressions closed. The formalities that followed were conducted entirely in Apache, with many blankets occasionally whispering translations to Margaret. White Elk spoke at length, apparently describing the successful exchange. When he gestured toward Margaret, the chief's penetrating gaze settled on her, assessing. "Grey Wolf welcomes you to our people," many blankets eventually translated. "He says your presence brings peace between our worlds." Margaret inclined her head respectfully. "Tell him I hope to be worthy of the trust placed in me." As many blankets translated, Margaret noticed how Swifthawk remained slightly apart from the other men. There was a subtle distance between him and his tribesmen that went beyond physical space. When he dismounted, she saw more clearly the extent of his disability. His left leg was rigid at the knee, forcing him to support his weight heavily on his right side. He moved with a pronounced limp, though he carried himself with undeniable dignity, his back straight and his movements deliberate. A few young men exchanged glances when Swifthawk approached to speak quietly to Grey Wolf. Their expressions carried a mockery that needed no translation, quickly masked when the chief responded. Margaret recognized the dynamics at play. Swifthawk's injury had diminished his status, making him an object of veiled derision. It was a language of hierarchy and worth that transcended cultural differences. Many blankets helped Margaret dismount, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle. "Come," the Apache woman said. "I show you Swifthawk's dwelling." They followed Swifthawk to a lodge set slightly apart from the others, near a stand of cottonwoods. It was modestly sized but well constructed, with smoke rising from a central opening. Margaret paused at the entrance, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what was happening. This would be her home now. This stranger would be her... what? Master? Husband? Swifthawk noticed her hesitation. He said something to Many Blankets, who nodded before turning to Margaret. "He says you may take time to rest. He will remain outside until you are comfortable." The unexpected consideration threatened to unravel Margaret's carefully maintained composure. She nodded wordlessly and ducked into the lodge. Inside, the dwelling was spare but orderly. A fire pit occupied the center, with sleeping pallets arranged on one side. Various tools, weapons, and household items hung from the support poles or were stacked neatly against the walls. It was the home of someone who valued order, something Margaret could appreciate. Many Blankets showed her where to place her belongings, explaining the basic features of the lodge. "Here, water. Here, food stores. You sleep here." She pointed to a pallet covered with furs. "Swifthawk, there." She indicated another sleeping area several feet away. Margaret's relief must have shown on her face, for Many Blankets gave her a rare smile. "Swifthawk is honorable man. He not take what not given." When the Apache woman left, Margaret sank down onto the sleeping pallet, finally allowing her body to acknowledge its exhaustion. She should be organizing her belongings, preparing food, making herself useful. But for just a moment, she needed to gather her strength and her wits. Outside, she could hear murmured conversations, the laughter of children, the ordinary sounds of a community at evening. So familiar, and yet so alien. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. Self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. Taking a deep breath, she opened her carpet bag and began unpacking the few items that defined her life. Her sewing kit, a small leather-bound Bible that had belonged to her mother, a daguerreotype of her husband William, in its protective case, a spare dress, undergarments, a woolen shawl for cold weather. She had just finished when Swifthawk entered, carrying her other supplies. He set them down carefully, then stood awkwardly, clearly uncertain of his role in this strange arrangement. "Thank you," Margaret said, knowing he probably wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he would recognize the sentiment. He nodded, then gestured to the fire pit and said something questioning. Margaret shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Swifthawk considered for a moment, then mimed eating, pointing to the fire. "Ah, food. Yes, I can cook," Margaret replied, rising to her feet despite her body's protests. Together, they moved around the lodge, Swifthawk showing her where cooking implements were stored, where water was kept, where dried meat and roots and berries were hung in leather pouches. Their communication was halting, limited to gestures and simple words, but somehow effective. As Margaret prepared a simple stew, adding small portions of the coffee and salt she had brought with her, she observed Swifthawk surreptitiously. Despite his disability, his movements were sure and efficient. His hands, when he demonstrated how to use the unfamiliar cooking tools, were strong but gentle. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him watching her with an expression that held neither ownership nor resentment, but something closer to wonder. That night, as she lay on her pallet listening to Swifthawk's steady breathing from across the lodge, Margaret tried to make sense of her new reality. She had been discarded by her own people, handed over to strangers like unwanted goods. Yet here, in this place, there was a curious kind of respect being offered to her. Not from everyone. She had seen the sideways glances, heard the whispers as she passed, but from this man with whom she now shared a dwelling. Perhaps, she thought as exhaustion finally pulled her towards sleep, they recognized something in each other. The experience of being deemed less valuable, of being pushed to the margins. Perhaps in their mutual displacement, they might find a way to navigate this strange new territory together. Dawn arrived with the sound of movement throughout the village. Women's voices calling to children, the nickering of horses, the rhythmic pounding of something that Margaret couldn't identify. She opened her eyes to find Swifthawk already gone from his sleeping pallet, the lodge quiet, save for the soft crackle of the banked fire. For a moment, disorientation washed over her. The unfamiliar smell of smoke and leather, the feel of fur beneath her instead of her cotton sheets, the dull ache in muscles unaccustomed to horseback riding, all served as stark reminders of her new reality. Margaret rose stiffly, straightening her rumpled clothing as best she could. She found water in a clay container and splashed her face, using her handkerchief to dry it. There was no mirror here, no familiar morning ritual of pinning up her hair. She rebraided it quickly, fingers moving by memory rather than sight. Outside, the morning air carried a chill that belied the heat that would come later. Margaret paused in the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed by the alienness of it all. Women moving purposefully about their tasks, some grinding corn between stones, others scraping hides stretched on frames. Children darted between lodges, their laughter a universal language. No one quite looked at her directly, but she felt their awareness of her presence like a physical touch. "You slept well?" The voice behind her made Margaret start. Many blankets approached, carrying a basket of what appeared to be roots. "Yes, thank you," Margaret replied, though in truth she had slept fitfully, waking at every unfamiliar sound. "Good. Today you learn our ways." Many blankets handed her the basket. "These need cleaning, cutting. I show you." The next hours passed in a blur of new knowledge, how to prepare the wild turnips that formed a staple of the Apache diet, how to tend the fire properly, how to address the chief's wife. With eyes lowered, speaking only when spoken to, Margaret's head swam with unfamiliar terms and customs, but she applied herself with the same methodical attention she'd always given to learning new sewing techniques. "Where is Swifthawk?" she finally asked, as they worked side by side, scraping the turnips with stone tools that felt awkward in her hands. Many blankets gestured toward the hills. "He hunts, not big game. His leg makes it difficult. Small animals, birds." Margaret nodded, absorbing this information. "His injury? How did it happen?" The Apache woman's expression darkened slightly. "Battle with Crow warriors. Many years ago, he killed 3 men, saved young ones, but arrow shattered his knee." She made a crushing gesture with her hands. "Medicine man could not fix. Bone grew wrong." "And his wife? I was told she died." Many blankets nodded. "Winter sickness, last snow, yellow blossom, my cousin, good woman." She eyed Margaret speculatively. "You have husband before?" "Yes, William. He died 6 years ago." Margaret didn't elaborate on the business failures that had preceded his death, the debts that had left her nearly destitute. "You have children?" "No." The familiar pain of that absence flickered through her. "It wasn't possible for us." Many blankets accepted this without comment. "Swifthawk has son, running fox, 14 summers. Lives in his uncle's lodge since mother died. This was unexpected. Margaret processed the information carefully. Will he come to live with us? Perhaps, if you and Swift Hawk make good marriage. Marriage. The word hung in the air between them. Margaret had known this was the arrangement, of course, but hearing it stated so plainly made her stomach tighten. We have not. That is, Swift Hawk and I haven't. Many Blanket's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Swift Hawk is patient, man. He knows you need time. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the edge of the village. A group of young men had returned from hunting, carrying a deer slung between them. Their arrival was greeted with appreciation, women coming forward to begin the work of butchering. Margaret noticed a boy among them, tall for his age, his bearing proud as he carried several rabbits on a stick. Running Fox, many Blankets confirmed, following Margaret's gaze. Swift Hawk's son. The boy glanced toward them, his expression hardening when he saw Margaret. He said something to the warrior beside him, who laughed. Even without understanding the words, Margaret recognized the sentiment behind them. That evening, Swift Hawk returned with a string of quail. He entered the lodge quietly, hesitating when he saw Margaret sitting by the fire, working on something in her lap. I hope you don't mind, she said, holding up one of his shirts. I noticed it needed mending. He approached cautiously, examining her work with surprise. The torn sleeve she had repaired was now reinforced with nearly invisible stitches, stronger than before, but retaining the shirt's flexibility. Swift Hawk touched the mending, then looked at Margaret with something like wonder. He spoke a few words, then, seeming to remember she wouldn't understand, placed his hand over his heart and nodded deeply. You're welcome, Margaret said softly. When they sat to eat the stew she had prepared, the silence between them felt, for the first time, almost comfortable. After the meal, Swift Hawk took out a small wooden flute and began to play, the haunting melody filling the lodge with unexpected beauty. Margaret listened, her hands still working on another piece of mending. In that moment, with darkness gathering outside and the fire casting dancing shadows on the lodge walls, she felt a curious sense of peace settle over her. Not happiness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. The days began to form a pattern as summer yielded to early autumn. Each morning, Margaret rose with the sun, tended the fire, prepared food, and worked alongside the other women of the tribe. Her hands, already calloused from years of sewing, developed new calluses from unfamiliar tasks, scraping hides, weaving baskets, grinding seeds between stones. Many Blankets remained her primary teacher and sometimes interpreter, showing patience when Margaret struggled with tasks that Apache children mastered at young ages. Other women were more distant, some openly skeptical of the white woman's presence. Whispers followed her. Too old, too weak, too different. But Margaret had weathered disdain before. In Fort Benton, she had been dismissed as a spinster, useful only for her needle. Here, at least, her efforts were acknowledged, if grudgingly. And there was Swift Hawk, whose quiet appreciation for her work never failed to warm something inside her that had been cold for too long. They developed a system of communication, part gesture, part broken English, for he knew some basic words, part Apache phrases that Margaret was slowly learning, and part intuition that grew stronger with each passing day. Sometimes, when the barrier of language frustrated them both, Swift Hawk would draw pictures in the dirt, illustrating what he couldn't say. Margaret discovered he had a gift for it, capturing with a few simple lines the essence of a bird in flight or a deer drinking from the stream. On the 14th day, Running Fox appeared at their lodge during the evening meal. He stood at the entrance, tall and proud, regarding Margaret with unconcealed suspicion before addressing his father in rapid Apache. Though she couldn't understand the words, the confrontational tone needed no translation. Swift Hawk replied calmly, gesturing for his son to enter, and eat. The boy hesitated, then sat as far from Margaret as possible, accepting the bowl of stew she offered without acknowledgement. The meal passed in uncomfortable silence. When it ended, Running Fox spoke again, his voice edged with something that sounded like accusation. Swifthawk's response was firm but gentle. The boy listened, jaw clenched, before rising abruptly and leaving without looking at Margaret. "He does not accept me," she said when they were alone, more statement than question. Swifthawk sighed, searching for words. "Mother, die. Hard for boy." He touched his chest. "Hurt here." Margaret nodded, understanding all too well the pain of loss. "Time," she said softly. "He needs time." The next day brought an unexpected challenge. Margaret was returning from the stream, carrying a basket of freshly washed clothing, when she encountered a group of young warriors. Among them was Tall Pine, a man whose contempt for Swifthawk was barely disguised and who had made no secret of his disdain for the white woman who had been brought to their village. He stepped into her path, saying something in Apache that made the others laugh. Margaret tried to step around him, but he moved to block her. "Excuse me," she said firmly, meeting his gaze despite the fear fluttering in her chest. Tall Pine smirked, replying in broken English, "Old white woman, why Swifthawk want you? Cannot give sons, cannot hunt, what good?" The cruel words stung, but Margaret had endured worse. She straightened her spine, her voice steady. "I serve his lodge, I mend his clothes, I cook his food. Now please let me pass." Tall Pine reached out and tipped her basket, sending the clean laundry tumbling into the dust. The other warriors laughed as Margaret knelt to gather the scattered clothing, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Suddenly a shadow fell over her. Swifthawk stood there, his face a mask of cold fury. Despite his limp, his presence radiated a dangerous intensity that made Tall Pine take an involuntary step back. Words flew between them, sharp as arrowheads. Though Swifthawk was physically disadvantaged, something in his bearing made the younger men grow quiet. One by one, they drifted away, until only Tall Pine remained, defiance warring with respect in his expression. Finally, with a dismissive gesture, he too departed. Swifthawk knelt beside Margaret, wincing slightly as his bad knee protested. Together, they collected the fallen laundry. When their hands touched, reaching for the same piece of cloth, neither pulled away immediately. "Thank you," Margaret said softly. He looked at her then, his dark eyes holding a complexity of emotions she couldn't fully decipher. "You not deserve shame." That evening, as Swifthawk taught her how to repair a torn moccasin, Margaret found herself studying his profile in the firelight. The strong line of his jaw, the silver threading through his hair, the quiet dignity in his bearing. He was not handsome in the way William had been, with his fair hair and easy smile, but there was a strength in Swifthawk that called to something deep within her. When he caught her looking, she didn't glance away as she once might have. Instead, she offered him a small, genuine smile, the first since coming to this place. After a moment of surprise, Swifthawk smiled back, transforming his solemn features in a way that made Margaret's heart beat just a little faster. October painted the landscape in gold and crimson, the cottonwoods along the creek blazing with autumn glory. The air turned crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains and the promise of winter to come. Margaret found herself watching the changing season with new eyes, learning to read the land as the Apache did, not as scenery, but as a living entity that provided, challenged, and taught those who paid attention. In her second month with the tribe, Margaret's position began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. It started with her needle. Many blankets had mentioned to the chief's wife that the white woman possessed unusual skill with thread and cloth. Curious, Morning Star had brought a ceremonial dress to Margaret, indicating a tear that needed repair. The work was delicate, requiring careful attention to the intricate beading that adorned the leather. Margaret had devoted an entire afternoon to it, matching the pattern so precisely that the mend was nearly invisible. Word spread quickly. Soon, other women were bringing their finest garments for her attention. Moccasins with complex beadwork, cradleboards with decorative elements, ceremonial shirts worn by the warriors. Margaret approached each task with reverence, understanding that these were not merely clothes, but expressions of culture and identity. "You have gift," many blankets told her as they worked side by side, Margaret sewing while the Apache woman prepared hides. "Magic in fingers," Margaret smiled. "Not magic, just practice and care." "Same thing," many blankets replied with unexpected wisdom. As her skills became valued, the sideways glances and whispers diminished. Women who had previously avoided her now nodded in greeting, sometimes bringing small gifts, a pouch of berries, a particularly fine piece of sinew for sewing, a jar of honey from a wild hive. Margaret accepted these tokens with gratitude, understanding their significance in a culture where generosity created bonds stronger than blood. Swift Hawk watched this transformation with quiet pride. Each evening, he would listen attentively as Margaret attempted to share her day's experiences in her gradually improving Apache, supplemented by gestures and the English words he knew. His patience never wavered, his encouragement steady when she struggled with pronunciation or forgot a term. In turn, Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to this man who had received her into his life with such unexpected grace. She learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders, to anticipate when his injured leg pained him most, to prepare the herbal tea that many blankets had taught her would ease his discomfort. Without discussion, their sleeping pallets had gradually moved closer together, though they had not yet crossed the final boundary between them. One evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the ground outside, Swift Hawk returned from hunting with a wooden box. He presented it to Margaret almost shyly. "For you," he said in English, "made." Inside was a collection of bone needles of different sizes, each polished to a smooth shine, along with several small stone tools for working leather. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the needles perfectly balanced for the fine work Margaret loved best. "They're beautiful," she breathed, running a finger over the delicate implements. "Thank you." Swift Hawk smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Winter coming, you need good tools." That night, as they sat by the fire, Swift Hawk began to tell her a story. His English was still limited, but with gestures and drawings in the ash, he conveyed the tale of how he had gotten his name. As a boy, he had spotted an injured hawk, and rather than killing it as others might have, had splintered its broken wing and tended it until it could fly again. The bird had been fierce and quick to heal, swift, and so the name had come to him. Margaret listened, entranced not just by the story, but by this glimpse into the soul of the man she was coming to know. When he finished, she hesitated only briefly before sharing one of her own. How as a girl in Pennsylvania, she had sewn her first quilt, working in secret to create a wedding gift for her older sister. "Was beautiful?" Swift Hawk asked. Margaret laughed softly. "Oh no, it was terrible. The stitches were uneven, the pattern all wrong, but my sister kept it until the day she died." The exchange of stories became a nightly ritual, bridging cultures and hearts in a way that transcended the limitations of language. Through these tales, Margaret learned of Swift Hawk's childhood, his vision quest as a young man, his pride when his son was born. In return, she shared memories of her life back east, her journey west after William's death, her struggles and small triumphs in Fort Benton. As they talked, the space between them seemed to shrink, night by night, word by word. Sometimes, when the fire burned low and Swift Hawk's voice dropped to a murmur, Margaret would feel a yearning so powerful it frightened her, not just for physical closeness, but for the deeper union of two souls who had found in each other an unexpected harbor. Running Fox remained a challenge, his visits to their lodge infrequent and tense. He spoke to his father but barely acknowledged Margaret, accepting her food with grudging nods. Yet one day, as an early winter storm howled outside, the boy arrived with a torn hunting shirt, holding it awkwardly toward Margaret. "Can fix?" he asked in English, the first words he had directly spoken to her. "Of course," she replied, careful to keep her tone matter-of-fact rather than revealing her surprise and pleasure. As she worked, Running Fox watched her hands with reluctant fascination. When she finished, presenting him with the mended shirt, reinforced at stress points with careful stitching, he examined it closely. "Good work," he said finally, the compliment extracted as if under duress. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a beginning. That night, when Swifthawk returned from a council meeting, Margaret noticed his troubled expression immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting aside her sewing. He sighed, settling beside her. "White soldiers, moving north." His hands sketched the shape of a fort. "Building here, near hunting grounds." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Will there be trouble? Maybe. Swifthawk met her eyes directly. If trouble comes, you stay, or go back to white people. The question hung between them, weighted with all the unspoken complexities of their situation. Margaret considered carefully before answering. "My place is here now," she said softly, "with you." Swifthawk's expression remained solemn, but his hand found hers in the firelight, fingers intertwining. They sat like that, connected and silent as the wind sang its ancient song around the walls of their lodge. Winter descended upon the valley with uncompromising force, wrapping the Apache village in a blanket of white that transformed familiar paths into strange, dreamlike landscapes. The cold drove the tribe closer together, physically in their lodges and spiritually through the stories shared around fires that burned day and night. Game grew scarce, making each successful hunt a cause for celebration. The dried berries, roots, and meat stored during summer's abundance became precious resources, carefully rationed to sustain the community until spring's return. For Margaret, the bitter cold brought unexpected gifts. Confined to the lodge for days at a time, she and Swifthawk developed a rhythm of domestic harmony that spoke more eloquently than words. They moved around each other with the ease of dancers who had practiced the same steps for years rather than months. When his injured leg stiffened painfully in the cold, she massaged it with a salve of bear fat and herbs that many blankets had taught her to prepare. When her hands grew stiff from hours of sewing in the dim winter light, he would gently rub warmth back into her fingers, a simple act of tenderness that often left her breathless. Their communication flowered in this confined intimacy. Margaret's Apache vocabulary expanded rapidly, while Swifthawk's English grew more fluent. They created a language unique to themselves, a blend of both tongues supplemented by signs and gestures understood only by them. On the longest night of the year, the tribe gathered for a ceremony to honor the sun's return. Margaret sat beside Swifthawk, wrapped in the beautiful blanket she'd made from rabbit furs under Many Blankets' guidance. The flames cast dancing shadows across faces both familiar and dear to her now. Grey Wolf with his dignity, Morning Star with her quiet strength, Many Blankets with her practical wisdom, and even Running Fox, who had begun to look at her with something less than suspicion. The tribal shaman, an ancient man named Sees Far, led the ceremony. His weathered hands raised to the star-filled sky as he chanted prayers in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. When he approached Margaret, touching her forehead with a mixture of ash and bear grease, she felt an electric current of belonging pass through her. This was no longer an alien ritual, but a shared affirmation of community. Later, as they walked back to their lodge through fresh fallen snow that squeaked beneath their moccasins, Swifthawk's hand found hers. "You are of the people now," he said quietly. "Seas far has given blessing." Inside their lodge, the fire's glow created a sanctuary of warmth against the winter night. Margaret busied herself preparing tea, aware of Swifthawk's eyes following her movements. When she handed him the steaming cup, their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away. "Margaret," he said her name softly as if tasting it. He rarely used it, often calling her by the Apache name he had given her. Naiu-ti-i, she who creates beauty. "I have question." She settled beside him, her heart suddenly racing. "Yes." He took a breath, searching for the right words. "In your people's way, we would be husband and wife now." The directness of the question caught her off guard. They had lived together for months, sharing a lodge, meals, and increasingly their hearts, but not their bodies. That final intimacy had remained unspoken between them, a line neither had crossed. "In my people's way," she replied carefully, "there would have been a ceremony in a church, with vows before God, and in your heart." His dark eyes held hers, unblinking. "What does your heart say?" Margaret felt the weight of the moment, the crossroads where past and present, two cultures, two lives intersected. "My heart says I belong here," she answered truthfully. "With you." He nodded, understanding all she hadn't said. Setting aside his cup, he reached for her hand, turning it palm up to trace the lines with his finger. "In Apache way, when two spirits find each other, Creator rejoices." His voice dropped lower. "I find your spirit, Margaret Wilson. Through darkness, through pain, I find you." The simplicity of his declaration moved her more than any flowery profession of love could have. This was a man who spoke truth plainly, whose actions had already demonstrated what his words now confirmed. That night, beneath the fur blankets as wind howled outside their lodge, Margaret and Swifthawk became truly husband and wife. There was awkwardness, yes, two bodies no longer young, both bearing scars visible and invisible, but also a tenderness that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. In Swifthawk's gentle touch, she found not possession, but reverence, not demand, but gift. And in her own response, she discovered passions she had thought long buried, a capacity for joy that transcended age and circumstance. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms with her head pillowed on his chest, Margaret felt a sense of peace so profound it seemed to radiate from her very bones. "Thank you," she whispered. Swifthawk's arms tightened around her. "For what?" "For seeing me," she answered simply. "Not just an old woman, not just a white woman, for seeing me." His hand stroked her hair, silver in the firelight. "You see me too," he murmured. "Not broken warrior, not lame man. You see Swifthawk." Their shared understanding, built patiently over months of living side by side, now deepened into something Margaret had never experienced. Not even with William, whom she had married young and loved dutifully, but never with this soul-deep recognition. January brought blizzards that isolated the village for days. Food stores dwindled, and Grey Wolf ordered a hunting party to set out during a brief break in the storms. Swifthawk prepared to join them, despite Margaret's concern about his leg in the deep snow. "Must go," he told her firmly. "Every hunter needed." She didn't argue further, helping him prepare with the same quiet efficiency that marked all their interactions now. As he dressed in his warmest clothing, Running Fox arrived unexpectedly. "I hunt with father," the boy announced, his gaze meeting Margaret's directly for the first time. She nodded, hiding her surprise and pleasure. "Take care of each other," she said, handing him a small pouch of pemmican she'd prepared. Running Fox accepted it with a slight inclination of his head that felt like a victory. "We'll bring meat," he promised, for Lodge. After they departed, Margaret worked steadily on a special project, a shirt for Running Fox, decorated with porcupine quills, in a pattern many blankets had taught her, symbolizing courage and clear vision. The work required intense concentration, a welcome distraction from her worry. 3 days later, as she stepped outside to gather snow for melting, Margaret noticed unusual activity at the village's edge. Riders were approaching, white men on horseback, their breath and their mounts clouding the air. Her heart stuttered with apprehension. Grey Wolf and several warriors went to meet them. Margaret recognized the military uniforms, the authoritative bearing of the lead rider. A captain, perhaps from the fort Swift Hawk had mentioned months ago. Without conscious decision, she found herself moving closer, drawn by the familiar language she could hear as the men's voices carried in the clear winter air. Requesting any information about a white woman named Margaret Wilson, the captain was saying. Believed to have been living among your people since last summer. Margaret froze, her breath catching. Someone from Fort Benton had sent inquiries. Perhaps Sheriff Donovan easing his conscience. We have authorization to escort her back to civilization, the captain continued. Her sister in Pennsylvania has been located and wishes to claim her. Sister? Margaret's mind reeled. Elizabeth had found her. After all these years of silence? Grey Wolf's response was measured, his English deliberate. We have no captives here. All who live with Apache do so by choice. The captain's face hardened. Nevertheless, if Mrs. Wilson is here, we are obligated to inform her of this opportunity to return to her people. Margaret stood paralyzed, snow melting unheeded in the bucket she carried. Return to her people. The phrase echoed in her mind, raising the question she had answered for herself months ago, but now confronted anew. Who were her people now? The soldiers established a camp just beyond the village boundary, close enough to maintain their presence, far enough to avoid provocation. Their fire burned through the night, a reminder of a world Margaret had begun to think of as her past. Inside Grey Wolf's lodge, a council gathered. Margaret sat beside Morning Star, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. The chief had summoned her after his initial meeting with the soldiers, his expression grave but not unkind. They come for you, he said simply. Say your sister looks for you. Elizabeth. The name conjured memories of a childhood shared in a small Pennsylvania town, braiding each other's hair, gathering wildflowers, whispering secrets beneath quilts as thunder rolled outside their window. They had grown apart after Margaret's marriage, Elizabeth disapproving of William's business ventures, Margaret defensive of her husband's choices. The last letter had come nearly 7 years ago, terse and formal, acknowledging William's death without offering comfort. What will you do? Morning Star asked now, her lined face softened with concern. Margaret looked around the circle, at Grey Wolf's dignified features, at many blankets who had become something like a sister, at the other tribal leaders watching her with expressions ranging from neutral to supportive. These people who had received her as an unwanted offering had somehow become family. I need to speak with Swift Hawk, she replied finally. This decision affects us both. Grey Wolf nodded. Hunting party returns tomorrow, if weather holds. Until then, soldiers wait. He fixed her with a penetrating gaze. You are not prisoner. Choice is yours. That night, alone in the lodge she shared with Swift Hawk, Margaret sat by the fire, turning her sister's unexpected reappearance over in her mind like a complex piece of beadwork. Why now? What had prompted Elizabeth to search for her after years of silence? And what would it mean to return to the white world? To Pennsylvania, presumably, after all she had experienced here? She tried to imagine it, wearing corsets and petticoats again, attending church socials, explaining to curious neighbors where she had been. Would they believe her if she told them the truth? That she had found acceptance and love among people they considered savages? That she had become wife to an Apache warrior and stepmother to his son? Or would they see only what they expected? A pitiable woman rescued from captivity, her stories dismissed as confusion or delusion. Margaret rose and moved about the lodge, touching the objects that defined her life now. The basket she had woven under many blankets' patient guidance, the deerskin dress she had sewn and embellished with beadwork, the sleeping robes she shared with Swifthawk. Each item told a story, represented a skill learned, a barrier overcome. Each connected her to this place, these people, this man. Sleep eluded her. When dawn finally broke, she dressed carefully in the clothes she had made with her own hands, not her old dress from Fort Benton, which remained folded at the bottom of her trunk, but the Apache garments that marked her as Na-U-T, she who creates beauty. Then she walked to the edge of the village where the soldiers' camp was stirring to life. The captain rose to greet her, his manner formal but respectful. Close up, she could see he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30, with a neat mustache and clear blue eyes. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Captain James Harrington, Fort Kearney." He gestured to a camp stool. "Please sit. Would you care for coffee?" The familiar aroma tugged at memories of her previous life. She accepted the cup, cradling its warmth between her palms. "How did my sister find me?" "A former sheriff from Fort Benton relocated to Pennsylvania. Apparently, he encountered your sister and mentioned the arrangement made with the Apache. Mrs. Williams, your sister, contacted the War Department immediately." Margaret noted the careful neutrality in his tone. No judgment of Fort Benton's actions, no comment on her current circumstances. "She's offered to pay your passage home," Harrington continued, "and to provide for your needs thereafter." Home. The word echoed strangely. Where was home now? "Captain, what would happen if I declined to return?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "Declined? I'm not certain I understand, Mrs. Wilson. You're being offered restoration to your family, to civilization. And if I consider this my home now?" Margaret kept her voice steady. "If I have made a life here that I value?" Harrington studied her, confusion evident in his expression. "Ma'am, with all due respect, these people took you as payment. Surely you cannot wish to remain." "They did not take me, Captain. I was given to them. There's a distinction." She set down her cup. "And what began as an arrangement has become something else entirely." Before he could respond, a commotion arose from the village. The hunting party had returned, laden with elk and deer, a successful expedition that would replenish the dwindling food stores. Margaret's heart leapt at the sight of Swifthawk, his face lined with exhaustion, but alive, whole. His eyes found her immediately, widening with alarm at her proximity to the soldiers. He dismounted awkwardly, his injured leg clearly paining him after days on horseback. Running Fox was at his side instantly, supporting his father with surprising gentleness. Margaret rose. "Excuse me, Captain, I must go." Harrington stood as well. "Mrs. Wilson, we'll remain until tomorrow. Please consider your sister's offer carefully. This is your chance to return to where you belong." Where you belong. The phrase followed her as she hurried towards Swifthawk, who had stopped midway between the hunting party and the soldiers' camp, clearly unwilling to approach the white men. "Husband," she said in Apache, reaching for his hands, "you're safe." His expression was a storm of emotions, relief at seeing her unharmed, confusion at the soldiers' presence, fear of what their arrival might mean. "Why are they here?" he asked, his voice rough from days in the cold. "They've come for me," she answered simply. "My sister has sent them." Running Fox moved closer, protective. "She does not go," he declared with unexpected fierceness. She is Apache now. The boy's defense stirred something profound in Margaret's heart. She placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling him tense but not pull away. "Thank you," she said softly. Swifthawk's gaze never left her face. "What do you want?" Such a simple question, yet it carried the weight of two worlds, two lives, two possible futures. Margaret took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. "I want to speak with you, privately." They walked in silence to their lodge, leaving Running Fox to help with the meat distribution. Inside, Swifthawk sank onto his sleeping robe, extending his injured leg with a grimace of pain. Margaret knelt beside him, gently removing his moccasins, massaging the knotted muscles of his calf, as she had done so many times before. "They say my sister searches for me," she began, keeping her voice calm despite the turmoil in her heart. "She offers to take me back to Pennsylvania, to care for me there." Swifthawk was silent, his face unreadable. Only the tension in his shoulders betrayed his emotions. "The captain waits for my answer," Margaret continued. "They leave tomorrow." Still, Swifthawk said nothing, his silence, usually comfortable between them, now stretched painfully. "Will you not speak?" Margaret finally asked, her composure beginning to crack. "Will you not tell me what you want?" His dark eyes met hers, filled with a depth of feeling that took her breath away. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for you to follow your heart. If it leads to your sister, to your old life, I will not hold you." The selflessness of his response brought tears to Margaret's eyes. This man, who had received her as an unwanted obligation and slowly, carefully made her the center of his world, was offering her freedom to choose, even if that choice took her from him. "I made vows once before," she said, her voice catching, "to a man I respected but never truly knew. We lived side by side for 20 years, yet remained strangers in many ways." She took his weathered hand in hers. "With you, in just these few months, I have been more truly seen, more deeply known than in all my years before." Dawn broke clear and cold, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of rose and gold. Margaret stood outside the lodge, watching as the village stirred to life around her. Women kindled morning fires, children emerged yawning from warm lodges, hunters prepared for the day's work. The familiar rhythm of it wrapped around her like a cherished blanket. "It is time," Swifthawk said quietly, coming to stand beside her. She nodded, drawing strength from his presence. They had talked through the night, weighing past against present, blood ties against chosen family. By first light, Margaret's path had become clear, not without regret but with certainty. Together they walked to where Captain Harrington and his men were breaking camp, the soldiers moving with the efficiency of long practice. "Mrs. Wilson," the captain greeted her, his expression expectant. "I hope you've had sufficient time to consider your sister's generous offer." "I have," Margaret replied, "and I'm grateful to Elizabeth for her concern. Please convey to her my love and my regrets." Harrington's brow furrowed. "Regrets? I will not be returning to Pennsylvania." Margaret stood straight, her voice unwavering. "My place is here now, with my husband and his people." The captain's gaze shifted to Swifthawk, who stood proudly beside her, despite his limp, then back to Margaret with disbelief. "Husband? Mrs. Wilson, surely you cannot mean—" "In the eyes of the Creator and this tribe, Swifthawk is my husband," Margaret interrupted gently but firmly. "I have made my choice, Captain. I would appreciate if you would deliver a letter to my sister, explaining my decision." Harrington looked as if he might argue further, but something in Margaret's demeanor stopped him. Perhaps he recognized the quiet dignity in her bearing, or perhaps he simply realized the futility of debate. After a moment, he nodded curtly. "As you wish. I'll wait while you write your letter." Within the hour, Margaret had penned her farewell to Elizabeth, not without tears, but with the peace of one who knows her own mind. She watched as the soldiers mounted up, Harrington tucking her sealed letter carefully into his saddlebag. "God be with you, Mrs. Wilson," he said, touching his hat brim in a final salute before leading his men away across the snow-covered plains. As their figures diminished in the distance, Margaret felt Swifthawk's arm encircle her waist. "No regrets?" he asked softly. She leaned against him, drawing warmth from his body. "Only that I didn't find you sooner." That evening, the tribe gathered for a ceremony unlike any Margaret had witnessed before. Grey Wolf had summoned everyone to the central fire, where Margaret found herself seated beside Swifthawk in a position of honor. Running Fox stood nearby, his young face solemn but no longer hostile. "Today, Na'Iuti chose to remain with the people," the chief announced using Margaret's Apache name. "Not as captive, not as stranger, but as one of us. The spirits have guided her path to our fire." Many blankets stepped forward, bearing a beautifully crafted tunic adorned with intricate beadwork and quills. "Made by women of tribe," she explained, presenting it to Margaret. "For sister who stays." One by one, members of the tribe came forward, elders offering blessing, women bringing small gifts, even children shyly presenting treasures of polished stones or carved wooden figures. Margaret received each with deepening wonder, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. When Running Fox approached, he carried something wrapped in soft hide. "For you," he said, unwrapping a delicate bone comb carved with symbols of eagles in flight. "I made." Margaret accepted it with trembling hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." The boy hesitated, then added softly, "Mother." A single word that bridged chasms of grief and resentment, opening a path toward healing. Margaret's heart swelled with emotion too profound for speech. She simply nodded, holding his gaze until he nodded back. An understanding reached, a covenant formed. Later that night, as they lay wrapped in furs against the winter cold, Swifthawk traced the lines of Margaret's face with gentle fingers. "White men think you too old," he said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "Too old for value. They are blind." "And what do you see?" she asked. "I see wisdom in silver hair," he replied. "Strength in hands that create beauty, courage in heart that finds new path." His fingers moved to the corners of her eyes, where time had etched its marks. "These lines tell stories. Good stories. I see treasure where others see only years." Margaret curled closer, resting her head on his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. "And I see a man who walks with difficulty but stands taller than any warrior I've known." Spring came early that year, the snow retreating up the mountainsides, revealing tender shoots of green beneath. Margaret stood outside their lodge, watching Running Fox teaching younger children how to fashion simple bows from flexible branches. His patient instructions, delivered with growing confidence, filled her with quiet pride. Swifthawk approached from behind, his arms circling her waist. "Happy?" Margaret leaned back against him, savoring the solid strength of him. "Yes," she answered simply, "this is where I belong." And it was true. The woman who had been deemed too old by Fort Benton, traded away like surplus goods, had found herself treasured beyond measure, not despite her years, but because of the wisdom, skill, and compassion those years had cultivated in her. In this place, with these people, with this man, Margaret Wilson had discovered the most precious gift of all, the freedom to be fully herself, valued for exactly who she was. As the sun climbed higher in the spring sky, she turned in Swifthawk's embrace, raising her face to his. Their kiss was unhurried, a reaffirmation of the bond between them that had grown not from obligation, but from the patient nurturing of mutual respect into deep, abiding love. The journey that had begun in fear and resignation had led her home at last.